The city buzzed with life as Maggie Turner shuffled along the crowded sidewalks of New York. At 80 years old, she was a fixture on these streets, a familiar yet unnoticed face in a city that never paused for anyone. Her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame, worn and faded from years of use. A knitted hat pulled down over her gray, thinning hair, and a tattered scarf wrapped around her neck, shielding her from the chilly wind. Her cart, a rusty, old thing with a squeaky wheel, held everything she owned: a few blankets, some plastic bags filled with cans, and a worn-out photograph in a cracked frame. The photograph was a reminder of a life that felt more like a distant dream now. It showed a younger Maggie, smiling proudly in front of a small restaurant. In the picture, her eyes sparkled with ambition and warmth, her hair neatly pinned back, and her apron freshly pressed. Those days were long gone, and now she wandered from shelter to shelter, often sleeping on park benches or in doorways, fighting to stay warm. Maggie's routine was predictable. She would start her mornings at the soup kitchen, where the volunteers recognized her but rarely spoke beyond a polite greeting. After breakfast, she would make her way to the recycling center, trading in cans for a few dollars that would buy a coffee or a roll. The afternoons were spent looking for a place to rest, somewhere out of the way, where the police wouldn't chase her off. By evening, she'd be back at the shelters, hoping there would still be a bed left. As Maggie continued to push her cart down the sidewalk, a few people cast quick glances her way. Most didn't notice her, and the ones who did seemed to quickly look away, as if by ignoring her, they could pretend she didn't exist. It was a kind of invisibility she had grown used to over the years. There was a time when she might have fought it, when she would have walked with her head held high, when she had something to fight for, but now, there was only resignation. The sky grew darker, and the wind cut sharper as evening approached. Maggie's fingers, stiff with cold, struggled to pull the scarf tighter around her neck. She could feel the bite of winter coming early this year, and the shelters were already overcrowded. She needed warmth, even just for a little while. It was then that she noticed the soft glow emanating from the windows of a nearby restaurant, the kind of place she had once been familiar with, where the lighting was dim and the plates were made of fine china. She hadn't intended to go inside. The restaurant looked far too elegant, with its shimmering chandeliers and finely dressed patrons sipping on glasses of wine. Yet the warmth radiating from those windows was too much to resist. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the door, and a soft chime announced her entrance. The sudden rush of heat was almost overwhelming, and for a moment, Maggie just stood there, letting it wash over her. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Eyes glanced her way, some filled with pity, others with disdain, as they took in the sight of an old woman in ragged clothes, her shoes caked with grime. The hostess at the front desk, a young woman with a practiced smile that now faltered, looked at Maggie as if unsure whether to greet her or ask her to leave. Maggie's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but steady. "Just a moment, miss. I only need to sit for a bit." She wasn't asking for a meal, just a brief respite from the cold. The hostess hesitated, glancing toward a manager who stood nearby, already frowning. "I'm afraid we can't." Before she could finish, a voice called out from across the room. "Wait." It was a young waiter, dressed in a crisp white shirt and black slacks, rushing over. His name tag read Charlie, and his expression was one of both recognition and disbelief as he looked at Maggie. He turned to the hostess and said firmly, "Let her stay." The hostess looked taken aback but stepped aside reluctantly. Charlie guided Maggie to a small table near the back, away from the prying eyes of the other guests. As she sat down, Maggie felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. She hadn't expected kindness here, in a place where luxury and wealth seemed to be the only currency. She wondered why this young man would go out of his way to help her when no one else seemed to care. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Charlie gave a small nod, studying her face intently. "I've seen you before," he said, more to himself than to her, as if trying to place where. "You look familiar." Maggie managed a tired smile. "I've been around a long time," she replied. "Maybe too long." She had learned not to expect anything from anyone, especially in a place like this. Yet there was something in the way Charlie looked at her, like he was searching for a memory hidden just out of reach. As the warmth began to seep into her bones, Maggie couldn't help but think back to another time, a different place that had once been hers. She had stood in a kitchen not unlike the one here, her hands flour-covered, her heart full of hope. But that had been years ago, and she wasn't sure anymore if it had even been real or just a dream she had clung to on lonely nights. The room was filled with the sounds of clinking glasses and soft laughter, but for Maggie, it all felt distant. Her gaze drifted to a wall of framed photographs near the bar, and there, in the middle, was a picture she recognized. It was a photograph of the Golden Spoon, taken decades ago. In the center of that photo, Maggie stood, smiling proudly, surrounded by a younger staff. Charlie followed her gaze and saw the same picture. His eyes widened with realization as he turned back to Maggie. "It's you, isn't it?" he asked, almost breathless. "You're Maggie Turner?" She met his gaze, the hint of a smile on her lips. "Yes," she said quietly. That was a long time ago. The realization hung in the air between them, as if the past and present had collided right there at the small table where Maggie now sat. Charlie's expression was a mix of disbelief and awe. He glanced at the photo on the wall, then back at the frail woman before him, struggling to reconcile the vibrant restaurant founder in the picture with the elderly homeless woman sitting in front of him. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. How did you end up like this?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with concern. He knew his question might be intrusive, but curiosity and a genuine desire to understand the story behind her fall from grace outweighed his hesitation. Maggie took a deep breath. She was used to being judged by her appearance, to the quick assumptions people made when they saw her on the streets. But there was something different in Charlie's eyes, something that made her want to open up, at least a little. "It's a long story," she began, her voice steady but lined with weariness. "Longer than I have time to tell tonight." Charlie nodded, sensing that the details would come out in their own time. "I'm sorry if this is too forward, but you really founded this place?" He gestured to the photograph on the wall, then to the elegant dining room around them. "Yes, I did," Maggie said, her gaze wandering over the restaurant's decor, which had changed so much since she had last set foot in it. Back then, it wasn't this grand. It was a small, cozy place, a family restaurant where people felt at home. That was what I wanted, a place where anyone could come and share a meal, no matter who they were. A wistful smile crossed her face as she spoke, but it quickly faded. Things changed. People changed. I lost the restaurant, and with it, I lost everything else. Charlie leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he listened intently. He could sense the weight of the years in her voice, the pain that had undoubtedly come from watching her dreams slip away. But before he could ask more, the manager approached, his brow furrowed in disapproval. "What's going on here?" the manager asked, his tone low but firm. He looked at Maggie with an expression that was a mixture of suspicion and irritation. "Charlie, is there a reason why this guest is being seated without a reservation?" Charlie quickly stood up, trying to shield Maggie from the man's scrutinizing gaze. "She's not just any guest," he replied, his voice unwavering. "This is Maggie Turner. She's the original founder of the Golden Spoon." The manager's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but then his lips curled into a skeptical smile. "The founder? Are you serious? That was decades ago." He shook his head dismissively. "We've moved on since then. The restaurant's been remodeled, rebranded. Whatever connection she had is ancient history." The dismissiveness in his tone stung Maggie more than she cared to admit, but she held her head high. "It may be ancient history to you," she said quietly, "but I built this place from the ground up. I put my heart and soul into it. That picture on the wall is proof enough of that." The manager glanced at the photograph, then back at her, clearly unconvinced. "Even if you are who you say you are, it doesn't change the fact that we're a business now. We can't just cater to anyone who walks in off the street." Charlie's jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth to argue, but Maggie raised a hand, stopping him. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice calm. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just needed a place to warm up for a few minutes. That's all." But Charlie wasn't ready to let it go. He turned to the manager, his voice firm. "She deserves better than that. Maggie built this place, and she should be treated with respect, not dismissed like a nobody." He felt a surge of frustration at the manager's attitude, the kind that overlooked the humanity in a person just because of their circumstances. The manager's expression hardened. "This isn't up for debate, Charlie. If she doesn't leave, I'll have to call security." Before Charlie could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me," a patron sitting nearby said, his voice carrying a note of indignation. He had been listening to the exchange and now stood up from his table. "Are you really going to throw an elderly woman out into the cold? Especially one who founded this very restaurant?" Murmurs spread throughout the dining room as other patrons began to pay attention, some nodding in agreement while others glanced around uneasily. The manager hesitated, glancing between the disgruntled customer, Charlie, and Maggie. The situation was quickly spiraling out of his control. Finally, with a forced smile, he relented. "Fine," he said, his tone stiff. "She can stay, for now." He turned sharply on his heel and walked away, muttering under his breath. Charlie exhaled, relieved that the confrontation hadn't escalated further. He turned back to Maggie, whose expression was a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "You didn't have to do that." He shook his head. "It was the right thing to do. You don't deserve to be treated that way." There was a pause before he added, "I'd like to hear more about your story, if you're willing to share." Maggie gave him a small, weary nod. "There's a lot to tell," she replied. "And not all of it is pretty. But I suppose, if you have the time, I can share some of it." As the noise of the restaurant resumed, Charlie pulled up a chair once more, settling in to listen. He could sense there was something significant about Maggie's story, something that went beyond the loss of a restaurant. And for some reason, he felt compelled to understand it, to learn what had brought her from the heights of success to the streets outside. As Maggie settled back into her chair, her gaze drifted again to the photograph on the wall, as if searching for the person she used to be. The image showed a different time, a different life, a life she wasn't sure she'd ever fully recover. But there was a spark in Charlie's eyes that made her want to try, to recall those days and piece together the story that had led her here. "It was the early '80s, she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the years in her tone. "Back then, I was full of ideas and energy. I wanted to create something special, something that wasn't just about food, but about people, about community. So, I took every penny I had, and I opened the Golden Spoon." Charlie listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. He could picture the younger version of Maggie that she described, full of drive and vision. It wasn't difficult to imagine her bringing the warmth she spoke of into the restaurant, making it feel like a place where everyone belonged. "At first, it was a humble little spot," she continued. "We didn't have the chandeliers or the imported marble floors. What we had were hearty meals, fair prices, and a sense of belonging. People would come in and stay for hours, just talking and laughing. We even knew most of the regulars by name." A smile flickered on her lips, but it faded just as quickly. "Those were good times." "What happened?" Charlie asked gently, sensing the sadness that had crept into her voice. Maggie's eyes clouded as she glanced down at her hands, now clasped tightly in her lap. "The restaurant grew, and with it came more challenges. My younger brother, Samuel, saw the potential for profit and insisted we expand. At first, I thought it was a good idea. I trusted him." Her voice wavered, and she paused, as if grappling with the memory. But Samuel had a different vision for the Golden Spoon. He wanted it to be upscale, exclusive, a place where only a certain kind of customer was welcome. The bitterness in her tone was unmistakable. Charlie leaned in closer, his brow furrowed in concern. "But that wasn't what you wanted," he said quietly. "No, it wasn't," Maggie replied, her voice growing stronger. "But I let myself get talked into it. We renovated, rebranded, And little by little, the restaurant I had built changed into something I hardly recognized. The prices went up, the clientele became more elite, and the community feel I loved so much started to disappear. She looked up, meeting Charlie's gaze with eyes that seemed both fierce and tired. But the worst was yet to come, she said, her tone dropping. Samuel convinced me to sign some papers, documents I thought were just to bring in new investors. It turned out, he had slowly been buying me out of my own restaurant. When I finally realized what had happened, it was too late. The golden spoon wasn't mine anymore. I was out. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and poignant. Charlie could feel his chest tighten as he listened. "He forced you out?" he asked, his voice low with disbelief. "Your own brother?" Maggie nodded, her expression hardening. "He saw it as just business, but to me, it was a betrayal. I fought it in court, but Samuel had the money and the connections. I lost everything, my restaurant, my savings, even my home." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "After that, it was just one thing after another. Without the restaurant, I couldn't find work. Bills piled up, and eventually, I ended up on the streets." There was a moment of silence as Charlie absorbed her story. He felt a deep sense of injustice on her behalf, a woman who had given so much, only to be discarded when it no longer suited someone else's agenda. "I'm so sorry, Maggie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't deserve that." "Life isn't about what we deserve," she replied, her tone resigned but not without a hint of resilience. "It's about what happens and how we choose to face it. I did the best I could, but sometimes that just isn't enough." For a while, neither of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. Charlie wondered how many times he had walked past a person like Maggie without realizing the stories they carried, the lives they had once lived. His eyes shifted to the bustling dining room around them, the elegance and luxury that Maggie had once dreamed of but now seemed worlds away from. Yet, there she was, sitting among it all again, a ghost from the past that had come back to haunt the present. Maggie's voice interrupted his thoughts. "It's strange, you know," she said softly. "I built this place, but I haven't set foot inside in nearly 20 years. I never thought I'd be back." "I'm glad you came back," Charlie replied sincerely. This place, they needed to remember where it all started. And who made it happen. She gave him a small, grateful smile. "You're kind to say that," she said. "But kindness doesn't change the past." "No," he agreed, "but it can change the future." As he spoke, a thought was forming in his mind, something that began as a flicker but grew stronger with each passing moment. He wasn't sure exactly how, but he knew he wanted to help Maggie, to give her back at least a piece of what had been taken from her. And maybe, just maybe, the golden spoon could be a part of that journey. As the hours passed, Maggie shared more details of how the golden spoon had come to life. She spoke with a passion that revealed just how much the place had meant to her, her voice growing stronger as she recounted the early days. It was as though, for a brief moment, she was reliving those memories, letting herself be the woman she once was, full of energy and hope. "It all started with a little loan," she explained, her eyes distant as she recalled the past. "I didn't have much, but I had a dream and a stubborn belief that I could make it work. I found this old building on the corner. Back then, it was a rundown diner, hardly anything to look at. But I saw potential in it. I spent months fixing it up, scrubbing floors, painting walls, cooking recipes in the kitchen to get them just right." She let out a light chuckle. "I think I must have tasted 1,000 batches of my grandmother's stew before I got it the way she made it." Charlie could see the light in her eyes as she spoke, and for the first time since meeting her, he felt he was catching a glimpse of the real Maggie, the one who had built something out of nothing. He imagined her in that tiny kitchen, working long hours, determined to turn her dream into reality. "The doors finally opened on a cold February day," Maggie continued. "I remember it so clearly because I was worried no one would come. But they did. At first, it was just a few locals who wandered in out of curiosity, but soon word spread. We served hearty meals at prices anyone could afford, and people started to feel at home. It wasn't about fancy decorations or expensive wines, it was about the atmosphere, the feeling that you belonged when you stepped through that door. She paused, her expression bittersweet. For a while, things were perfect. I'd come in before sunrise to start the bread, and I wouldn't leave until the last customer had finished their dessert. It was exhausting, but I loved every minute of it. Maggie's voice grew quieter as she continued. Then came the expansion. My brother Samuel saw how successful we were becoming and suggested we open a second location. I was hesitant. After all, the Golden Spoon was more than just a business to me. It was like a family. But Samuel was persuasive, and I wanted to believe that we could grow without losing what made us special. Charlie nodded, understanding how easy it was to get swept up in the idea of growth and opportunity. Did the second location change things? He asked. Maggie sighed. Not at first. The new place did well, and it gave us some breathing room. But then Samuel started pushing for more. He wanted to attract a wealthier clientele, bring in upscale chefs, add fancier dishes to the menu. I resisted at first because I didn't want to lose the essence of what we had built. But eventually, I gave in. She looked down at her hands again, fingers tracing the edge of the table. It wasn't immediate, but slowly, the restaurant started to change. We renovated the original location to match the new one's style. The prices crept up, the regulars I had known for years stopped coming as often, and I began to feel like I was losing control of what I had created. The sadness in her voice was palpable, and Charlie found himself wishing he could have seen the original Golden Spoon, the way it had been when Maggie's vision was pure and unspoiled by ambition and greed. It sounds like it was a special place, he said softly. The kind of restaurant people remember long after they've left. It was, Maggie replied, her voice filled with a quiet pride. But the heart of it disappeared when Samuel took over. He didn't see it the same way I did. To him, it was just a business, a way to make money. And when he saw the chance to push me out, he took it. Charlie's brow furrowed. Why didn't you fight harder to keep control? He asked, immediately regretting the question when he saw the pain in her eyes. I tried, she said simply. But Samuel was clever, and I trusted him for too long. By the time I realized what he was doing, the legal battle had already drained me of what little I had left. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. You see it coming, but you're powerless to stop it. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of her story settling over them like a heavy fog. Maggie's tale was not just about a restaurant, but about the loss of a dream and the betrayal by someone she loved. It was a story of resilience and heartache, of clinging to hope even when all seemed lost. Charlie cleared his throat, breaking the silence. What you created was more than just a place to eat, he said. It sounds like it was a community. That's something no one can ever really take away. She gave him a small, tired smile. Maybe, she replied. But it's been a long time since I felt like I belonged anywhere. Maggie's gaze turned distant, as if she were looking back at the years that had slipped away like sand through her fingers. Her voice, though steady, held a deep sadness as she continued. It didn't take long after Samuel took over for everything to unravel. The changes he made to attract a wealthier crowd worked, but at a cost. The people who had been with us from the beginning, our loyal customers, started to drift away. It was no longer the place they remembered, no longer the place I had envisioned. Charlie listened intently, his expression a mix of empathy and frustration. He had seen how quickly businesses could lose their soul when they chased after profit at the expense of their original values. He had worked in enough upscale restaurants to know that the food could be exquisite and the decor luxurious, yet something would always feel off without that sense of genuine warmth. It wasn't just the customers who changed, Maggie continued. The staff did too. Many of the original employees left because they didn't feel at home anymore. The new hires were skilled, sure, but they didn't have the same passion, the same love for the place. It became sterile. Her fingers traced the edge of the table, as if searching for a memory hidden in the grain of the wood. I tried to push back against some of Samuel's decisions, but by then, he had consolidated enough control to override me. I was on the outside looking in, at my own restaurant. She let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of years. It wasn't just a business to me, Charlie. It was my life. My heart. She paused, then continued in a voice laced with bitterness. Samuel's plans didn't stop at changing the restaurant's atmosphere. He had his eye on expansion, franchises, partnerships, anything that could bring in more money. He said it was about taking the Golden Spoon to the next level, but all I saw was my dream being turned into a chain, a brand. It wasn't about the people, the community, or the food anymore. It was about squeezing every dollar out of what was once a labor of love. Charlie's brow furrowed as he absorbed the weight of her words. And that's when he forced you out? Maggie nodded, her jaw tightening slightly. The legal maneuvering had been going on behind my back for months. Samuel had convinced me to sign documents that I thought were for routine business matters, but they were actually about transferring shares and power. I was naive, Charlie. I trusted him. I didn't think my own brother would betray me like that. She swallowed hard before continuing. When I finally realized what was happening, I tried to fight. I went to court, but Samuel had the resources to drag the process out, to bleed me dry. Every time I thought I was making progress, another setback would appear. The bills kept piling up, and I had to sell my house to cover the legal fees. The words seemed to take a toll on her, her shoulders sagging with the weight of those memories. In the end, I had nothing left. Samuel had won, and the Golden Spoon was no longer mine. I was left with no money, no home, and no purpose. A silence fell over the table, thick with the ache of loss. Maggie's story had taken Charlie on a journey from the bright, hopeful beginnings of a small family restaurant to the dark, bitter reality of corporate greed and betrayal. It was clear that the loss of the Golden Spoon wasn't just a financial blow for her, it was the destruction of something deeply personal, almost sacred. But why didn't you, Charlie began, but stopped himself. It felt wrong to question her further about why she hadn't reached out for help, why she hadn't found a way to rebuild. He could see in her eyes that there had been many factors, many setbacks, and likely, many moments of despair that had drained her will to fight. As if reading his thoughts, Maggie spoke again. After I lost the restaurant, I fell into a deep depression. I was too ashamed to ask for help, too broken to think clearly about what to do next. I had built my life around that place, and when it was gone, I didn't know who I was anymore. I couldn't see a future, so I just faded. Charlie felt a pang of regret for all the times he had walked past someone like Maggie on the street, never stopping to consider that behind those eyes was a story, a life that had once been full and meaningful. He had always assumed that the homeless were just different, separate from him. But Maggie's story made him realize how quickly everything could be lost, how any of them could be just one or two misfortunes away from a similar fate. After I sold the house, Maggie continued, I tried staying with friends, but you can only impose on people for so long. Eventually, I ran out of places to go. I had no family left, no safety net. So, I ended up on the streets. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way back. But as the months turned into years, I stopped hoping. The pain in her voice was raw, unfiltered. I learned how to survive out there. How to find shelter, where to get a meal. But surviving isn't the same as living. I became invisible, just another old woman pushing a cart. People stopped seeing me as a person. And I stopped seeing myself as one too. Charlie's throat tightened, and he reached across the table to place a hand on hers. You're not invisible, Maggie, he said firmly. Not to me. And I'm going to make sure you're not invisible to anyone else either. For the first time since she had started telling her story, Maggie's eyes glistened with something other than sorrow. It was a glimmer of hope, faint but unmistakable. The days that followed Maggie's revelations were different. Charlie found himself thinking constantly about her story, about the woman who had built the Golden Spoon from the ground up only to lose everything. It was as though the history of the restaurant had come alive in a way that none of the current staff or management had ever truly understood. Maggie wasn't just a part of its past, she was its soul, and the thought of her sitting outside on the cold streets seemed like a terrible injustice. the atmosphere at the Golden Spoon had shifted slightly. The other staff members, curious about the mysterious old woman, had started to talk among themselves, spreading snippets of what they had overheard. The story of Maggie Turner, the original founder, who had once infused the restaurant with warmth and a sense of community, began to circulate. Some of the employees started to see her differently. Instead of just an elderly woman with nowhere else to go, they saw someone who had once been at the heart of this place, who had sacrificed and worked hard to create something special. They would give her small nods of acknowledgement when she came by, and a few would even offer her a cup of coffee or ask if she needed anything. It wasn't much, but to Maggie, it felt like a small step back toward reclaiming a bit of her dignity. The customers, too, were starting to notice. A regular patron who had heard the story commented to a waiter that it was a shame how Maggie had been treated, wondering aloud how many other stories like hers existed out on the streets. Others asked the staff for more details about the Golden Spoon's history, genuinely curious to learn about the restaurant's original founder. Some even stopped by Maggie's table to offer a kind word, or just to say they admired her courage. However, not everyone welcomed the shift. The manager, still wary of Maggie's presence and the attention it was drawing, found the whole situation troublesome. He worried that focusing too much on her history would make the restaurant seem less polished, less exclusive. To him, the Golden Spoon was a high-end establishment, and the past should stay in the past. One evening, as Maggie was quietly enjoying a cup of tea that Charlie had brought her, the manager approached her table with a forced smile. "Maggie," he began, his tone polite but clearly rehearsed, "I understand you've been coming here a lot recently. I think it's wonderful that you want to revisit your old memories, but perhaps we could arrange for you to stay in a more comfortable place. You know, somewhere more suitable." Maggie looked up at him, sensing the underlying suggestion that she was not really welcome. She placed the cup down carefully, her hands steady. "I appreciate the offer," she replied, her voice calm, "but I'm not here to live in the past. I'm here because this place was my life, my dream. I just wanted to see what became of it." The manager's smile tightened. "Of course," he said. "And we're grateful for your contributions in the past. But the Golden Spoon is different now. It's moved on." The way he said it stung, as if he were implying that she hadn't moved on, that she was somehow stuck. Maggie kept her composure, but a sense of resolve stirred within her. She had come to accept her situation, but that didn't mean she would be dismissed so easily. Charlie appeared just then, sensing the tension in the air. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his gaze flickering between Maggie and the manager. "No problem at all," the manager replied quickly, his polite mask slipping just for a moment. "I was just suggesting that Maggie might be more comfortable elsewhere." "She's perfectly fine right here," Charlie said firmly. His tone left no room for argument. The manager sighed and gave a curt nod before walking away. After he left, Maggie looked at Charlie with a grateful smile. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he replied. "You deserve to be here as much as anyone else. More, actually." A warmth spread through her, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging, a small but meaningful reminder of what the Golden Spoon had once been. It was becoming clear that her presence was not just about revisiting the past, it was about reclaiming a piece of herself, about reminding this place and the people in it that she wasn't gone, that her story wasn't over. Charlie took a seat across from her. "You know," he said, "some of the regulars have been asking about you. They want to know more about the history of the Golden Spoon. I think there's an opportunity here to share your story, not just with the staff, but with everyone." Maggie looked at him, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Do you really think people would care?" she asked. "I know they would," Charlie replied. "And I think it's time this place remembered where it came from and who helped build it." The idea of honoring Maggie Turner, the original founder of the Golden Spoon, quickly gained momentum. Charlie's suggestion to share her story struck a chord with many of the staff and even some of the restaurant's loyal patrons. They recognized that Maggie's tale was more than just a piece of the past, it was a vital part of what made the Golden Spoon special. Charlie proposed hosting an event to celebrate Maggie's contributions and to acknowledge the restaurant's humble beginnings. It would be a dinner gathering, open to the community, with a portion of the proceeds going to support local shelters and services for the homeless, a gesture that Maggie wholeheartedly endorsed. The manager, initially reluctant, saw an opportunity for positive publicity and reluctantly agreed to the plan, as long as it was handled tastefully. Flyers were printed, invitations sent out, and the staff began preparing the restaurant for the event. It was a flurry of activity in the days leading up to the dinner. For Maggie, it felt surreal to be at the center of all this attention after years of being invisible. Part of her wondered if anyone would actually show up to hear her story, but she was also deeply touched by the effort Charlie and others were putting in. On the evening of the event, the Golden Spoon was filled with an air of anticipation. The dining room was elegantly decorated, with framed photos of the restaurant's early days displayed throughout. One particular photo, Maggie's favorite, showed the original sign she had painted herself, reading "The Golden Spoon, where friends and family gather." It was a reminder of what the place had once been and what it had meant to the community. As the guests arrived, Maggie couldn't help but notice a mix of familiar faces and strangers in the crowd. Some of the people who had frequented the restaurant decades ago were there, older now but still carrying memories of the place. Others were young, new patrons who had only ever known the Golden Spoon in its upscale form, unaware of the simpler times Maggie had often spoken about. Charlie stood at the front of the dining room, microphone in hand, and began the evening's introductions. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you all for being here tonight. We're gathered to honor someone very special, someone who has not only made a lasting impact on this restaurant but on the lives of so many people in this community." He gestured toward Maggie, who was seated at a table near the front. Maggie Turner is the original founder of the Golden Spoon. She started this place from scratch, with a dream of creating a restaurant where everyone could feel at home. Over the years, that dream grew into something much bigger, and tonight, we're here to celebrate her legacy. The room erupted in applause, and Maggie felt a warmth rise in her chest. For so long, she had been defined by loss and hardship, but tonight, it was as if those years had melted away, leaving only the joy of what she had once created. As the dinner progressed, guests shared stories about their experiences at the Golden Spoon. Some of the older patrons recounted how Maggie had welcomed them like family, even on days when they didn't have enough money to pay for a full meal. A former staff member, now well into his 50s, spoke about how Maggie had taken a chance on him when he was a struggling young man with no direction. "She didn't just give me a job," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "She gave me a chance to believe in myself. That's something I've carried with me my whole life." Maggie listened to each story, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and gratitude. It was as though the pieces of her life, which had seemed so scattered and broken, were being gathered up and put back together, forming a mosaic that was still beautiful, even if some of the edges were rough. As the evening went on, there was a moment for Maggie to speak. With some hesitation, she rose from her seat, the microphone in her hand feeling both foreign and familiar. She looked out at the faces watching her, some of whom she recognized and others she did not. "Thank you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know what to say except that I am deeply, deeply grateful for all of you being here tonight." She took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. "When I started the Golden Spoon, I didn't know if it would last a year, let alone become something as cherished as it has been. All I wanted was to create a place where people could share a meal and find a bit of comfort. I'm proud to know that, even if it's changed a lot over the years, the spirit of this place is still alive." There was a round of applause, but Maggie held up a hand to quiet the crowd. "But I also need to be honest," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I lost my way. When my brother took over and the restaurant became something different, I couldn't stop it. I lost not just my business, but my sense of purpose. And for a long time, I felt like I had lost my identity too." The room grew quiet, every person hanging on her words. "I've spent years trying to survive out there on the streets, feeling like a ghost of the person I used to be. But coming here tonight, hearing all of you share these stories, it's reminded me that maybe I'm not just a ghost. Maybe the person I was is still here somewhere, and maybe there's still more for me to do." Her final words were met with a standing ovation. It was as if the applause was not just for the woman standing before them, but for the life she had led and the resilience she had shown. For Maggie, it was a moment of redemption, a chance to reclaim the part of herself she had thought was gone forever. As Maggie took her seat again, Charlie was there to greet her, his eyes glistening. "You were incredible," he said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I don't think anyone here will ever forget this night." Maggie looked up at him, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Neither will I," she whispered. The applause lingered in the air, and as Maggie returned to her seat, the atmosphere in the Golden Spoon was charged with a renewed sense of admiration and gratitude. The stories that had been shared, and Maggie's own words, had touched something deep in the hearts of the people present. It was as if the spirit of the original restaurant had been rekindled, if only for this one night. But not everyone shared in the sentiment. The manager, who had been standing off to the side during the entire event, wore a strained expression. As the night continued, the guests mingled, some approaching Maggie to express their appreciation or share memories of the old days. Meanwhile, the manager quietly conferred with a few members of the staff, his dissatisfaction evident in the tightness of his jaw. He saw an opportunity to regain control and approached Maggie as she was speaking with a small group of guests. "Maggie," he said, his voice cutting through the conversation, "I'd like to have a word with you." The tone of his voice caused the group to fall silent, and Maggie turned to face him, a hint of apprehension in her eyes. "Of course," she said, maintaining her composure. The manager gestured toward a quieter corner of the dining room, and as they walked over, the tension in the air seemed to grow. "Look," he began, his voice lowered but still carrying a sharp edge, "this whole event has been very touching, and I understand that people feel a certain nostalgia for the restaurant's past. But the Golden Spoon isn't what it was back then, and we need to keep things professional." Maggie's brows furrowed slightly. "Professional," she echoed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the manager continued, "this place has a reputation to maintain. We cater to a certain clientele, and while tonight's event was a nice gesture, we need to get back to business as usual." His eyes met hers, and there was a coldness in his gaze that had not been there earlier. "It's important that the image we project remains upscale, exclusive." Maggie felt a familiar sting, one that came from years of being dismissed and cast aside. "So, you're saying that I don't belong here?" she asked quietly, though there was a firmness in her voice. "I'm saying that the restaurant has moved on," he replied, his tone laced with condescension. "And so should you." At that moment, Charlie appeared at Maggie's side, his face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. "That's enough," he said, stepping forward to face the manager. "You're talking about the founder of this place, someone who gave everything she had to build the Golden Spoon. You don't get to decide when she's moved on." The manager's eyes narrowed. "Charlie, this is a matter for management. You're out of line." "No," Charlie shot back, his voice rising, "you're out of line. All night, people have been talking about what this place used to be, and you just want to pretend like it doesn't matter. But it does matter. The Golden Spoon was never supposed to be just another fancy restaurant. It was meant to be a place for people, a place with heart. And Maggie is the heart of this place, whether you like it or not." The confrontation had attracted the attention of several guests, who were now watching the exchange unfold. Whispers spread through the room as more people began to realize what was happening. Maggie, standing between the two men, took a step forward. "If this restaurant has forgotten its roots," she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet resolve, "then perhaps it's time to remind everyone of where it came from." She turned to face the guests who had gathered nearby, many of whom had heard pieces of the conversation. "For those of you who don't know," she began, "when I started the Golden Spoon, it wasn't about exclusivity or catering to the wealthy. It was about creating a place where anyone, rich or poor, could come and share a meal, could feel like they belonged. It was about community." The murmurs among the guests grew louder, some nodding in agreement. "The changes that happened over the years," Maggie continued, "they weren't my choice. They were made by people who cared more about money than about people. And that's not what the Golden Spoon was ever supposed to be. Her eyes swept across the room, landing on familiar faces and new ones alike. I may have lost the restaurant, but I haven't lost my voice. And I haven't forgotten why I built this place. Charlie couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as Maggie spoke. She wasn't just defending herself, she was reclaiming the vision that had been taken from her. The manager, seeing the shift in the room's atmosphere, tried to regain control. "With all due respect, Maggie," he said, his voice strained, "things change. Businesses evolve. We can't run this place like it's still the 1980s. Maggie's gaze was unwavering. "You're right," she replied, "things do change. But that doesn't mean we have to forget what's important. If we sacrifice our values for the sake of appearance, then we lose the very thing that made this place special." As her words hung in the air, one of the older guests stepped forward. "I remember when Maggie used to come out of the kitchen just to chat with us," he said, his voice filled with nostalgia. "It was never just about the food, it was about how she made us feel welcome. That's what made the Golden Spoon great." Another guest nodded in agreement. "Maybe it's time to bring some of that back," she said. "Not everything has to be about status." The manager, realizing that he had lost the room, took a step back. "Fine," he said curtly. "If that's how you all feel." He gave Maggie one last look, his expression a mix of irritation and resignation, before turning and walking away. Maggie, taking a deep breath, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She hadn't expected to confront the manager or speak so openly about what the Golden Spoon had become, but now that she had, it felt like a piece of herself had been restored. Charlie placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. The Golden Spoon needed to hear it. Maggie nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Maybe it did," she replied. "But there's still more to be done." In the days that followed the event, the atmosphere at the Golden Spoon underwent a subtle but meaningful transformation. The stories shared in Maggie's speech had left a lasting impact on the staff and many of the regular patrons. There was a renewed appreciation for the restaurant's history and a desire to reconnect with its original spirit. Small but significant changes started to happen, adjustments to the menu that reflected some of the simpler, more comforting dishes from the early days, and even the occasional decision to offer meals at discounted prices to those in need. For Maggie, the shift was a reminder that her efforts hadn't been in vain. The public recognition and the warmth she had felt from the community reignited a sense of purpose she thought she'd lost. She realized there was still work to be done, and perhaps her journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning anew. Charlie had been thinking about Maggie's future as well. After the confrontation with the manager, he approached her with an idea that had been forming in his mind ever since she first shared her story. "Maggie," he began one afternoon as they sat at her usual table, "I know you've given a lot of thought to what comes next. I've been thinking, too." She looked at him with curiosity, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "What do you have in mind?" "I think we should start something together," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "Not just a restaurant, but a place that really captures what the Golden Spoon used to stand for. A place where anyone can come in and feel welcome, just like in the old days." He hesitated for a moment, then continued, "I was thinking, what if we opened a new place? Somewhere small and warm, where we could help the people who need it most." Maggie felt a spark of hope at his words. She hadn't considered starting a new venture, not after all the losses she had endured. But now, with Charlie's encouragement and the support she'd felt from the community, the idea didn't seem so impossible. "A new place," she echoed thoughtfully. "What would it be like?" "I was thinking we could keep it simple," Charlie said. "We could serve affordable, hearty meals, just like you used to. And we could make it a point to offer jobs and training for people who are struggling, give them a chance to get back on their feet, just like you did for so many of your old employees." The more he spoke, the more Maggie could envision it. She could see the small kitchen, the cozy dining area filled with laughter and conversation. It wouldn't be about fancy decor or high prices, but about providing nourishment, both for the body and the soul. It sounds wonderful, she said, her eyes brightening. But where would we even start? I don't have any money, and I'm not sure where to find the resources. Charlie's expression was determined. We'll figure it out, he replied. I've already spoken to a few of the regulars. They loved the idea when I mentioned it. Some of them have offered to help get things off the ground, even if it's just with small donations or helping us find a space. And we could start a fundraiser to get the rest. Maggie felt her heart swell with gratitude. You really think we can make this work? She asked, her voice a blend of hope and uncertainty. I know we can, he said, his voice steady and confident. You've already proven that you can build something beautiful from nothing. This time, you'll have help. Over the next few weeks, Maggie and Charlie began to lay the groundwork for their new venture. They found a small, vacant building on the edge of town that had once been a bakery. It wasn't much, but it had potential. With the support of the community and the funds they managed to raise, they began renovating the space, cleaning, painting, and turning the old bakery into a place of comfort and warmth. They decided to name it the Second Spoon, a nod to Maggie's original restaurant, but also a symbol of new beginnings and second chances. It was a place where people from all walks of life could come together, share a meal, and feel like they belonged. Maggie threw herself into the project with a renewed sense of purpose. She found joy in the small things, the smell of freshly baked bread, the sound of laughter from the volunteers who helped prepare the space, and the sight of the sign being hung above the door. The Second Spoon, a place for everyone. Months later, the Second Spoon had become a bustling little hub of warmth and hospitality. What had started as an idea born from loss and resilience was now a reality, drawing in a diverse crowd of patrons. There were families, college students, workers on their lunch breaks, and people who had nowhere else to go. Maggie welcomed them all with a smile, just as she had done in the old days. The restaurant wasn't fancy, but that was never the point. The tables were simple, covered with checkered cloths, and the walls were adorned with photographs of the community's history, some dating back to the early days of the Golden Spoon. There was even a framed picture of the original restaurant, with a young Maggie standing proudly at the entrance. Next to it, a new photo showed her and Charlie, side by side, grinning as they held up a sign that read, "Grand Opening of the Second Spoon." For Maggie, these days felt like a rebirth. She found herself looking forward to each morning, the smell of fresh coffee brewing and the hum of the kitchen as meals were prepared. The work wasn't easy, there were long hours, and sometimes the funds were tight, but it was fulfilling in a way she hadn't felt in years. She was doing more than just running a restaurant, she was building a community again. One of her greatest joys was seeing the impact the Second Spoon had on the people who worked there. Charlie's idea of offering job training and employment to those who were struggling had turned into a key part of the restaurant's mission. Several of the staff were people who had once been homeless, like Maggie, or were recovering from other hardships. Here, they found more than a job, they found purpose and hope. Charlie often marveled at how the Second Spoon had come together. He knew it wouldn't have been possible without Maggie's spirit and determination. Watching her move around the dining room, chatting with customers and offering encouragement to the staff, he saw not just a founder, but a woman who had refused to let the world break her. One afternoon, as the lunch rush began to wind down, Maggie stood at the front of the restaurant, looking out at the tables filled with people talking, laughing, and sharing stories. It wasn't exactly the Golden Spoon, but it didn't need to be. This was its own place, with its own soul, and it was alive in a way that she had always dreamed. Charlie walked over and handed her a cup of tea. "To second chances," he said, raising his own cup in a toast. Maggie smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "To second chances," she echoed. "And to never giving up." As they clinked their cups together, the sounds of the Second Spoon buzzed around them, carrying on the legacy of a dream that had come full circle, remade, renewed, and more resilient than ever.